The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden streaks over the sprawling fields that stretched beyond our house. The late afternoon air carried the scent of damp earth and distant bonfires, mingling with the rustling of leaves as a soft breeze weaved through the trees. It was the kind of day that felt untouched by time, calm, predictable, safe. I sat on the wooden steps of our porch, running my fingers over the rough grain of the railing, listening to the occasional chirp of crickets hidden in the tall grass. Inside, the distant clatter of my mother's cooking filled the house, the sound of metal on metal as she prepared for dinner. The warmth of home surrounded me, a cocoon of familiarity. And then, there was a voice, deep, steady, unmistakable. "I hear you've never been hunting before." I turned. My father's friend, Daniel, stood by the gate, one foot casually resting on the bottom rail. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark jacket and sturdy boots, the kind you wear when you expect to walk for miles. His presence always carried a quiet authority, something that made people listen when he spoke. "I haven't," I admitted, standing up, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. My father had spoken of Daniel often, a skilled hunter, a man who knew the land like the back of his hand. He had spent years navigating the thick woods, tracking animals with a patience I could never quite understand. And now, for some reason, he had taken an interest in me. "It's time you learn," he said, his lips curving into a slight smile. "Your father said you're ready." I glanced toward the house, expecting to see my father step outside, nodding in approval. But the porch was empty. The front door, which had been left slightly ajar, now stood still, as if waiting. I frowned. Had he gone inside without me noticing? Still, there was no reason to doubt Daniel. He had been a friend of the family for years. "When?" I asked. "Now." A strange shiver crawled up my spine. The sun was already setting. I had assumed hunting trips took place at dawn, when the animals were just beginning to stir. But Daniel's expression was unreadable, and his voice held no room for negotiation. I hesitated, but something in his gaze pinned me in place. "All right," I said. Daniel turned, leading the way toward the truck parked at the edge of the driveway. I followed, my feet moving on instinct, though my mind whispered an unshakable thought. Something about this didn't feel right. The truck rumbled over the dirt road, the tires kicking up clouds of dust as we drove deeper into the forest. The sky had darkened to a dusky blue, streaked with the last remnants of sunlight. Shadows stretched long between the towering trees, their branches twisting together like tangled fingers. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, thick with the promise of night. Daniel drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel. I glanced at him from the corner of my eye, trying to gauge his mood. He had always been a man of few words, but tonight there was something different, something unreadable in the way he kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I shifted in my seat. "So, what are we hunting?" His lips twitched, just barely. "Deer, if we're lucky." I nodded, though something about the way he said it made me uneasy. His voice was too calm, too careful, like he was measuring each word before speaking. Minutes passed in silence, the road growing narrower as the trees thickened around us. The truck jolted over a hidden route, and Daniel's arm instinctively reached across me, pressing against my chest to steady me. The contact was brief, his warmth seeping through the fabric of my shirt before he pulled away. "Sorry," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the road. "It's okay," I said, but my heart was pounding for reasons I didn't quite understand. The truck came to a stop in a small clearing. The trees formed a natural barrier around us, their trunks stretching high into the darkening sky. Daniel cut the engine, the sudden silence settling heavy between us. "We'll walk from here," he said, stepping out. I followed, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The cold night air wrapped around me, sending a shiver down my spine. Daniel retrieved a rifle from the back of the truck, checking the chamber before slinging it over his shoulder. He glanced at me. "You ever shot one of these?" I shook my head. "No." He studied me for a moment, then handed me the gun. "Here. Hold it." I hesitated before wrapping my fingers around the stock, the metal cool against my palm. It was heavier than I expected, grounding, solid. Daniel stepped closer, his presence pressing against my side as he adjusted my grip. "You need to be steady," he murmured, his voice low, close. His hands covered mine, guiding my fingers over the trigger. "Don't pull too hard. Just a gentle squeeze." His breath was warm against my cheek, his touch lingering longer than necessary. The scent of him, wood smoke and something faintly musky, filled my senses, making it hard to focus. I swallowed. "Like this." He nodded, his fingers brushing over mine as he pulled away. "Good." We walked deeper into the woods, the path winding between thick undergrowth. The further we went, the more my nerves tingled, an unspoken tension threading through the night air. Something about this felt off. Not the forest itself, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the scent of damp earth, but the silence between us. It wasn't the easy quiet I had expected. It was heavy, charged, like something unspoken was pressing against the edges, waiting to break free. I stole another glance at Daniel. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the way he walked, something restrained, deliberate. "Daniel," I said hesitantly, "are you sure this is a good idea? It's getting late." He stopped, turning to face me. The shadows played across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the curve of his lips. "You scared?" I hesitated. "A little." Something flickered in his gaze, amusement, maybe, or something deeper. He stepped closer, and suddenly, the air between us felt thin, charged. "Don't be," he murmured. I wanted to believe him, but my pulse was thrumming in my throat, a different kind of fear creeping into my chest. Not the fear of the dark, or the forest, or the hunt. The fear of something unknown. Something dangerous. Something I wasn't ready to name. We walked in silence for a while, the tension between us growing with every step. The deeper we went, the darker the forest became, the trees pressing in like silent watchers. Then Daniel stopped. "Look," he whispered. I followed his gaze. Through the trees, a deer stood, its body half hidden in the shadows. Its ears twitched, its muscles coiled with the tension of something that knew it was being watched. Daniel pressed a hand to my shoulder, guiding me into position. Slow breath. Steady hands. I raised the rifle, my heart pounding. But as I looked through the sight, I realized something. It wasn't the deer I was thinking about. It was the man beside me. The way his fingers lingered on my skin. The way his voice sent a shiver down my spine. The way I felt when he looked at me, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite understand. My finger trembled on the trigger. Daniel's breath was warm against my ear. "Now." I exhaled. The shot rang through the forest, shattering the silence. The deer bolted. And when I turned to Daniel, his eyes were already on me, dark, unreadable. Something between us had changed. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next. The silence after the shot was thick, pressing against my ears like the air itself had turned to stone. The deer was gone, its retreat nothing more than a rustling whisper swallowed by the trees. My fingers trembled on the trigger, my breath unsteady. I had missed. Daniel didn't speak at first. He just stood there, watching me. The rifle felt heavy in my hands, heavier than before, as if it had absorbed all the weight of this moment, this thing I couldn't name sitting between us. I turned to him, waiting for some kind of reaction. A word, a sigh, maybe even disappointment. But his expression remained unreadable. His eyes flickered down to my hands, still gripping the gun too tightly, then back up to my face. "You hesitated," he said finally, his voice softer than I expected. I swallowed, nodding. "Yeah." The forest stretched around us, dark and endless. The world felt smaller here, like we were standing in a place that existed outside of time. Just us. Just the trees. Just the sound of our breathing, shallow and uneven. Daniel stepped closer, slow and deliberate. "Why?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? That it had nothing to do with the deer, with hunting, with fear? That it was him. That it had always been him. He reached out, his fingers brushing over my wrist. A barely there touch, but enough to send a tremor through me. "You're shaking," he murmured. I forced out a breath. "It's cold." It wasn't. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. His hand tightened around my wrist, firm but not unkind. His touch was warm, grounding, but it made everything inside me feel unsteady. "Is that all?" I didn't answer. A gust of wind whispered through the trees, stirring the leaves into a restless hush. The moment stretched between us, too fragile, too loaded. Daniel exhaled, a quiet sound that barely reached my ears. Then, as if testing the limits of something neither of us had acknowledged, he reached up and traced a slow line along my jaw. I flinched, not from fear, but from the sheer force of what that touch did to me. "Daniel," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "Say it," he interrupted, his voice steady but his grip uncertain. My heart pounded so hard I was sure he could hear it. I swallowed, my throat dry. "I don't know what this is." He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Liar. I should have pulled away. I should have stepped back, created space between us, done anything but stand there like I was waiting for something to happen. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, every part of me humming with the weight of this moment." Daniel's fingers ghosted down my arm, slow and deliberate, sending chills down my spine. He was watching me, his gaze searching for something, some kind of confirmation, some kind of permission. But I didn't know how to give it. The air was thick with something unspoken, something dangerous, something that made my stomach twist in ways I didn't understand. "I shouldn't be here with you," I whispered. His jaw tensed. "But you are." A long pause. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "And I don't think you want to leave." I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Because he was right. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to break the moment. I didn't want to stop feeling whatever this was, even if I couldn't name it. Daniel took another step closer, and I felt it, the shift, the point of no return, the moment that would change everything. His breath was warm against my skin. I could smell the faint traces of tobacco, of pine, of something distinctly him. My fingers twitched at my sides, aching to move, to reach out, to do something. But I was frozen. And then, a sound. A rustle in the distance, barely there but enough to break whatever spell had been cast between us. Daniel tensed, his hand dropping away from me as he turned sharply toward the noise. My breath hitched, my pulse still racing, my body still humming with the ghost of his touch. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, without looking at me, Daniel took a step back. "We should go." His voice was different now, measured, careful. Like nothing had happened. Like nothing had almost happened. I nodded, swallowing hard. But as we turned back toward the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line we weren't supposed to. And I wasn't sure if we could ever go back. The drive back was silent. Daniel gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his eyes fixed on the road like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. I sat beside him, staring out the window, the dark forest blurring past. The truck's engine hummed low, a constant noise that barely filled the space between us. I could still feel it, the weight of his touch on my skin, the ghost of his breath against my cheek. Every nerve in my body buzzed with something I didn't know how to process. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. But it was something. I swallowed hard and glanced at him. His jaw was set, tense, like he was wrestling with something he refused to say out loud. "Daniel," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at me. "Forget it," he said, his tone flat, distant. The words hit me harder than they should have. My chest tightened, a dull ache forming somewhere deep inside me. "Forget what?" I pressed, though I already knew. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Tonight. That moment. Whatever you think happened, it didn't." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. "Are you serious?" His grip on the wheel tightened. "Yeah." The weight of his words settled in my chest like a stone. I turned back to the window, my reflection barely visible against the dark glass. My face was unreadable, but inside, my thoughts were a tangled mess. Was he ashamed? Regretful? Or was he just afraid? Because I was afraid too. Afraid of what this meant. Afraid of what I wanted it to mean. Afraid that if I pushed too hard, he'd shut down completely. Minutes passed, each one heavier than the last. The headlights carved a path through the darkness, but the road ahead felt uncertain. I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "You really think we can just pretend nothing happened?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "We have to." I turned to him, searching his face for something, anything, that would tell me he didn't mean it. But he wouldn't look at me. "Why?" My voice was quieter now, the fight draining out of me. His hands flexed on the wheel. "Because it's easier that way." Easier. I let the words settle in the air between us. Maybe it was easier for him. But not for me. I shifted in my seat, my hands balling into fists against my thighs. "Do you regret it?" A sharp inhale. The first crack in his armor. He didn't answer right away. And that silence, that hesitation, was all I needed to hear. I nodded to myself, looking back out the window. My chest felt tight, like something inside me was unraveling too fast for me to catch it. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to demand answers. But I knew Daniel. Knew that pushing him too hard would only make him retreat further. So I said nothing. And neither did he. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. The night pressed in around us, thick with the weight of things unsaid. By the time we pulled into my driveway, the tension between us had settled into something unspoken, something fragile. Daniel finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. "We don't talk about this," he said quietly. I met his gaze, searching for any hint of doubt. But all I found was resolve. A part of me wanted to fight it. A part of me wanted to reach across the seat and make him say the truth out loud. But another part of me, one I hated, understood. So I nodded. "Okay." His shoulders relaxed just slightly, but the distance between us had already formed. I opened the door and stepped out, the cold night air rushing over me. My legs felt unsteady, my body still humming with everything I was trying to push down. As I reached the porch, I heard the truck's engine rev. I turned just in time to see the red taillights disappear down the road. He was gone. And somehow, it felt like he had taken a part of me with him. I stood on the porch long after Daniel's truck disappeared into the night. The air was cold, the kind that crept under your skin and settled in your bones, but I barely felt it. My hands still tingled, my body still humming with something I couldn't shake. I wanted to believe that he was right, that we could pretend, that we could go back to how things were before the woods, before the rifle, before the moment that had changed everything. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no going back. The screen door creaked behind me, and I turned to see my father standing in the doorway. His face was unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest. "Did you enjoy the trip?" he asked, his voice even. I hesitated. There were 1,000 ways I could answer, 1,000 things I could say. Instead, I nodded. "Yeah." He studied me for a moment longer before stepping aside. "Go inside. It's late." I did as I was told, my footsteps feeling heavier than before. The warmth of the house should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It felt too bright, too normal, like I had walked into a place I no longer belonged. I climbed the stairs to my room, shutting the door behind me. In the silence, I let out a slow breath, my fingers brushing over my wrist, the spot where Daniel had touched me. I closed my eyes. Would I ever see him again? Would he act like nothing had happened? Would I? The weight of the night pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. Then, just as I was about to turn off the light, a vibration. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen glowing against the darkness. I hesitated before picking it up, my heart pounding as I saw the name flashing across the screen. "Daniel." I swallowed hard, my thumb hovering over the answer button. For a moment, I let myself wonder, what would he say? Would he take it all back? Would he finally admit the truth? Or would this be the end? I exhaled, my fingers tightening around the phone. Then, before I could think, before I could hesitate, I answered. And everything changed.